Howdy, everyone. Welcome back to the Traditional Thomas. For those of you tuning in for the first time, welcome. My name is Nicholas Cavazos. It's good to have you here. Welcome back to another episode of Sancta Sapientiae. For those of you who do not know, Sancta Sapientiae is a Latin phrase that means holy wisdom. And it's a series in which we go through St. Thomas Aquinas, the great angelic doctor of the Catholic Church. We go through his great Summa Theologica, summary of theology. We go through the entire science of theology. The reason that we do this series is ultimately, at the end of the day, so that we can understand our faith better as traditional Catholics, but also, and more importantly, to have better union with the person of Jesus Christ. In this series, we go through the Summa Theologica, but we also don't want to just kind of trek through it and try to maybe glean some sections for ourselves. At the end of the day, what we're wanting to do in this series is go through it with the great commentary tradition, particularly the commentaries of Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, the great 20th century anti-modernist Dominican theologian and commentator. We're wanting to understand these things because it is my belief that as traditional Catholics, that what we need more now than ever is to go back to the sources of our traditional Catholic patrimony, to go back to the great dogmatic manuals and texts and tracts in order to help us understand the crisis in our own day. Because so much of the problem nowadays in the crisis, in this period of current crisis in the church, really does come down to just a lack of good formation in Catholic theology and spirituality. The text that we're using for our show today is the One God Commentary. This is a commentary which, unfortunately, is a bit expensive to read. I don't believe it's in current print. You can find a couple copies on Amazon and some other websites, but usually they range anywhere from $200 to up to $1,200. And so what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to be taking you through an online version as we go through the Summa. Last week, we went ahead and dived into this first section in the One God Commentary, and we went over specifically the history of Thomism, roughly speaking. It was very much so a kind of a flyby treatment of the subject of Thomism. However, today we're going to be diving into the specific methodology of Thomism. So today's episode is going to be definitely a little bit more heady, a little bit more philosophical. I'm going to try my best to define terms that may be a little bit confusing for you viewers, especially if this is your first time really engaging dogmatic and manualist style theology. However, I'm hoping that as we go through it, you'll appreciate St. Thomas Aquinas' method of why and how he did theology, because really this method that you're going to be learning today is in a certain sense part of just what is called the scholastic method of doing theology in the church. Theology is, again, a science, right? It's a body of knowledge, and a science has a method, right? If it's any good science. And so therefore, in order to understand the science, we need to practice this method. And so today we're going to be introducing you to St. Thomas Aquinas' particular method or methodology. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right, everyone, here we are picking off right where we left off in the One Commentary. So we ended up ending on the history of Thomism, and we're going to be diving into now, as you can see here, the method of St. Thomas, especially in the structure of the articles of the Theological Summa. Again, this is a bit in-depth stuff that we're going to be covering. This is not your typical YouTube video, much less your typical online trad video. However, I'm wanting to display this because ultimately it's really important that we understand Thomas's model before we dive into the Summa Theologiae itself. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. How this will again work is I'll go ahead and read through these and give you some of my thoughts, try to explain maybe some confusing things for you if you do not know what they mean. Again, if any of you have questions for me about this book or just about just roughly anything that we're covering in this course, go ahead and put a question in the bottom in the description, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So today it says, many seem to think that before Descartes wrote his Discourse on Method, traditional philosophy was not yet fully and unmistakably cognizant of the rules governing sound reasoning for the construction and teaching of knowledge. Many others, on the contrary, think that Descartes, who despised history and his predecessors, could easily have found out from these latter and true rules of method. Logicians are even of the opinion that the Discourse of Method could have been written more scientifically than Descartes' one, in accordance to the teachings of Aristotle and St. Thomas. I should like in this article to explain briefly the main features of St. Thomas's method. Let us see first, by way of a statement of the question, that several of our contemporaries have to say about it. When we shall examine how the angelic doctor found the solid foundation of his method in Aristotle's writing, and how he made use of analysis in the inducive inquiry, and also of the synthesis of demonstration. Finally, we shall see how closely connected his analysis and his synthesis in light of the divine contemplation. All right, I zoomed in a little bit closer here for you, so you maybe can see a little bit better. So again, this first paragraph, essentially what Father Lagrange is saying is that that there's many historians essentially who think that before Descartes wrote his discourse, right, his Discourse on Method, traditional philosophy, as it says here in this first sentence, was not yet fully and unmistakably cognizant of the rules governing sound reason for the construction and teaching of knowledge. So essentially, this is a subject which is involving the philosophical subject of logic, right? This is what we're specifically talking about, is logic. And in this, one thing that's important to note is that you could, in a certain sense, I've seen different people give different opinions on this, but it's really with Descartes and with the philosopher Immanuel Kant that you really get the birth of what is now called modern philosophy. The period in which we are living in right now, my friends, as the time I'm making this video, 2022, and going forward for at least the foreseeable future, is not what we call the modern period in philosophy. We generally call this the postmodern. The moderns, modernity, right? All these types of words and phrases of speech that just essentially mean this time, right? The time of essentially Enlightenment philosophy. Descartes and Kant being, again, two of the big heavy hitters. Some call one the grandfather and the other the father of modern philosophy. And I think that those are true in many ways. Now, there are many people who essentially assume, as right here in this paragraph, that Descartes, right, he essentially, again, to read this first sentence, traditional philosophy was not yet fully and unmistakably cognizant of the rules governing sound reason of the construction and teaching of knowledge. Essentially, that traditional philosophy wasn't that logical until Descartes, which personally I find that sentence to be somewhat amusing, that's even a statement that people would make. However, as Father Lagrange elaborates as you go further down, perhaps he would have been benefited if he would have been more induced into the philosophical method of Aristotle and St. Thomas. One note as we kind of transition now to this next sentence, as you'll see two things. Number one, Aristotle and Aquinas are generally always paired together. I remember seeing one time in this larger group me discussion about the person of St. Thomas Aquinas, this one individual make, I guess, the spicy take that Thomas Aquinas wasn't at all in any way an Aristotelian, not even just kind of like a moderate Aristotelian or a partial Aristotelian, but just not one at all. One thing you're going to see very clearly is Aquinas is definitely heavily influenced by Aristotle. But then second, and this is what I would argue is more important, because this is actually going to be part 3 of our kind of introduction to Sancta Sapientia. Part 3 is that you can find in this last sentence where he says, finally, we shall see how he closely connected analysis and synthesis in the light of divine contemplation. What this is essentially saying is that St. Thomas was not just reading books, right, reading scholarly treatises of the past and writing, and that was it, right? Rather, this goes back to an earlier video that I made, I believe maybe last year, on what is a theologian. A theologian, and this is a massive simplification, right? So please do not take this as this is definitively what it is. But a theologian, inside of what makes a theologian is it is a man of prayer. It is a man who prays, who contemplates divine truth. Again, this is a simplification, but it is you can't divorce prayer from the work of theology in a certain sense. Prayer and contemplation is something that is very much so needed. This is why on this show we don't want to just understand great theology and philosophy for the sake of just understanding it and puffing up our mind or our intellect, if you will, but rather wanting to understand it so that we can, one, be humbled by this being who we call God, but then number two, serve this God with a willing mind and a ready heart. And therefore, we need to pray. We need to go into contemplation. So it's very important for us as we go to the study of theology to always begin it in prayer, to have a very healthy prayer life, such and so forth. All right, so now let's go ahead. It says right here on the various judgments about this method. So these are the different essential takes on this method. And you're going to find some very interesting things. Again, note that this book is written in 1943 or 45, I believe, if my memory is correct. And one thing you'll notice is, again, during this time of the 40s, Lagrange is already hinting at the problems of the Nouvelle Theologie and ressourcement theology. I have a whole series eventually planned where I want to go through really the main ressourcement texts and go to show you some of the problematic implements about that. Not to say that the entire system is in and of itself problematic, but the large problematic things that you find inside ressourcement thought. But you're going to see Father Lagrange kind of hinting at some of these things in some of this introduction. He says, nowadays, there are some who say that the method of St. Thomas is too scholastic and artificial, that it is not sufficiently historical and real. This is a huge pot shot, if you will, right? A huge crack at ressourcement thought. For those viewers of you who do not know, let me again try to explain that term ressourcement or nouvelle theologie. This is again trying to be somewhat simplistic just for the sake of new viewers. Nouvelle theologie, that term is a term in French which just means essentially the new theology. And the new theology is essentially a strand of theology, or school, maybe you could say, a school of theology that arose in the wake of the destruction of modernism, which was a philosophical and theological heresy condemned by Pope St. Pius X in the early 1910s. And this movement took from modernism certain principles, but specifically one of the principles being a certain hatred for the scholastic method. Again, this is a big simplification of this description. However, ressourcement, which also means return to the sources, was the cry of many of these Nouvelle Theologie thinkers. They thought that essentially theology had really become, especially since the time of Eterni Patris, the great encyclical by Pope Leo XIII, that theology had become too dry, too arid, too scholastic. Essentially, it was too crystalline, and that theology needed to have fresh wind or fresh air, if you will, blown into it. And the fresh air, the fresh wind, if you will, was essentially two things. One, going back to early Christian sources such as Scripture or the Fathers, which, as we talked about last week, that's not bad in and of itself, right? That's not at all. But two, to really be open-minded and in a certain kind of a naive open-mindedness, but be open-minded to the world, as specifically the different philosophical systems of the Enlightenment. And then I guess maybe the consequence being, if you're a Nouvelle Theologie thinker today, if you carry that on to its logical conclusion, being open to some of the postmodern philosophical systems. The church for the longest time absolutely did not put up with any type of modern philosophy. In fact, this whole structure of neo-scholasticism, which this show is dedicated to, is to attacking the modern errors that are found in philosophy and theology. But one of the things, again, that these Nouvelle Theologies thinkers would do is they would harshly critique the scholastic method. And so you see this again in this first paragraph, that Father Lagrange, who is this great opponent of the Nouvelle Theologie, right? He's in fact the one who coined the term La Nouvelle Theologie, if my memory is correct. He's combating this in this first sentence. Nowadays, there are some who say that the method of St. Thomas is too scholastic and artificial, that it is not sufficiently historical and not real, right? Many of the Nouvelle Theologie thinkers essentially saw the scholastic method or the scholastic schools, right? As one, too artificial, so too fake, too dry, too arid. But then also that it wasn't historically understanding St. Thomas Aquinas properly. It wasn't real. It was too artificial, etc., etc. Right? This is something that is all, at the end of the day, I don't believe to be true. I believe that the scholastics understood Aquinas very well. To continue, it says this: it is, so they say, so the Nouvelle Theologie style thinkers, too much of an a priori method, almost always a process of deduction and analysis, or else in the analysis itself, there is too much abstraction. It even seems at times to confound logical abstractions with the objectivity of things. Some, though not realizing that they are nominalists nowadays, assert that St. Thomas speaks sometimes of matter and form, of essence and existence, as if these were distinct realities. Right, and you can see his quotations right here, number 13. Quotations are something very important. Again, just for you new people out there, always check the footnotes. Check the footnotes. You'll always be able to be illuminated and kind of see what's going on. So let's read this footnote. He says, and I'm probably going to butcher this name, Edgar de Bruyn, in his St. Thomas de Aquinas, 1929, page 99, writes, quote, if we wanted to remain true to the tradition of the school, so the kind of scholastic method, we should be led to believe that from the beginning, Thomism committed the mistake of confusing the logical and the real. St. Thomas speaks of essence, which means kind of the substance of a thing, essentially, as if it were a reality. He reasons about the matter and form of corporeal things as if they were distinct realities that are in opposition. Right, so he's commenting. So let me break some of this all down for you viewers. He's essentially saying, right, that, again, he's saying that the Nouvelle Theologie is essentially saying that the scholastic method is too dry, too arid, it's not understanding the historical Thomas very well, as well as it engages too much in deduction and analysis, a priori, so hypothetical understandings of things. And you'll also see, as right here, too much abstraction, seeing things too abstractly, not in the real way. Now, what's interesting is that he says, not realizes that they are nominalists. One of the first problems that you find in certain elements, not all, because again, I don't want to paint with too much of a broad brush, but certain amount of what you see in a lot of philosophical errors in this time in the 20th century is essentially people being philosophical nominalists. Again, if you do not know what nominalism is, you can go either and check this earlier video that we did last week on, or my last episode rather, on the subject of Sancta Sapientia. We talk a little bit about nominalism in that. However, you can also go and check the link in the description below, and you'll find a wonderful video from the Society of St. Pius X on Martin Luther and nominalism. Not saying Luther was a complete nominalist. He was definitely influenced by certain nominalists. I mean, that's what he was in a large certain sense. You see that in last episode. However, he's not a complete nominalist in every sense of the way, but he is very nominalistic in a lot of other areas. All right, so this document continues. It says, to be sure, for the angelic doctor, even for any consideration of the mind, matter is not form, created essence is not existence, and therefore, before any consideration of the mind, matter is distinct from form, and essence from existence. Yet form and essence are not, for St. Thomas, that which is, but that by which something is, nor does it follow that they are merely logical entities and not really realities. All right, and then again, to check the footnote right here, you can see this is taken from Summa Theologica, Prima Pars, question 13, article 1. Objection number 2, and then question 54, again with the Prima Pars, article 1. But in these days, many no longer know how to distinguish between metaphysical abstraction of direct consideration and logical abstraction of the reflection considered. And again, when we check here the footnote, he says, according to the teaching of St. Thomas, and so this is from specifically St. Thomas's commentary on the sentences, he says, the direct consideration of metaphysics, which is called the first intention, is concerned with the object as conceived by the mind, with the real nature itself of individualized things, as, for instance, the essence of man, whereas the reflex consideration of logic, which is sometimes called the second intention, is concerned with the object only according to the subjective mode of its existence in the mind. Thus, for instance, logic considers the formal universality of the predicate or subject, or of the laws of the syllogisms. Likewise, the distinction is said to be real when it precedes the consideration of the mind, and logical when it follows this consideration. In fact, however, before the consideration of the mind, matter is not form. It can be separated from the latter so as to receive another form. All right, so it says right here, continuing, therefore, they think only that which is real, namely the concrete singular. Hence, for them, the abstract object not only is not concrete, but is also not real. Thus, the essence of man, of virtue, of society, and such things would not be anything real, and the whole of metaphysics, not accepting the principles of contradiction, would be reduced to logic, logical abstractions, logical being, or as they say, to extreme intellectualism that is without reality and lifelessness, right? This is essentially a lot of what these Nouvelle Theologie thinkers are asserting, and his response being that to them. They would not dare to say explicitly that the abstract principles of contradiction, that sometimes things cannot be the same time, be and not be, right? And that's a very important first principle of logic, if you will, is not a real law, is not a law of real being, but only a logical law governing the operations of the mind, as the laws of syllogism are. To such an extreme admissions, however, is not brought by this silly and by the present day common enough objection. Moreover, several say that the method of St. Thomas often proceeds not according to the natural way in which the mind operates, but in a conventional way of the schools of the 13th century, namely, by first proposing objections, at least three, which might be proposed afterward with better results. For placed at the beginning, they are a source of obscurity rather than of light to the mind. Furthermore, it is indeed surprising, some say, that St. Thomas begins by setting forth the errors, introducing them the forma vintur quod non, and only after this comes the true doctrine, which is proved in very few words by an appeal to authority, more at length, however, in a theoretical manner, and finally the objections to be solved. To give you an example a little bit about what Father Lagrange is talking about, he's talking about the structure of how St. Thomas's Summa is laid out. So essentially, for those of you guys who do not know, how St. Thomas Aquinas structures his Summa, I'll give you a broader understanding of this. He lays out theology, right, in kind of a Platonic way, which is often called an exitus rexitus model, which is essentially this. Exitus meaning kind of exiting or proceeding from, right? All theology proceeds from God and comes back to God, right? So for instance, this gives you a kind of a visual understanding of what I was talking about. I kind of look it up here, but it says right here, this goes to show you the fundamental structure of St. Thomas's Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. So exitus rexitus. So as you can see right here, part one of the Summa, which is called the prima pars, right, is theology, right? So it's God and the outflowing of his creation. So you see how, for instance, when we go back here to the Summa Theologiae, how it starts off here in the beginning of the Summa Theologiae with the first part, right, or prima pars, it's the first 119 questions. And he begins right here where we are, right? The treatise on the one God, you could call it, or the tract on the one God. And so we start all theology with the person of God. This is so key because today, theology, and when I say today, I'm meaning it taught really in the modern seminaries. This is one of the main problems that you have in modern seminary, is that theology does not begin with the person of God. Rather, theology has become so pastoral, and again, I put that in air quotes, because we do theology now starting with man and then go to God. And so let me give you an example. I'm going to use a very controversial example, but I think this is a very good example to illustrate what I'm saying. We know from the authority of God himself through divine revelation and through the natural law implanted inside of our hearts that adultery, right, is wrong. That's not too controversial. But we also know with that homosexuality is wrong, right? We know these types of actions are against the natural law of God. Now, because of these things, we see how God has revealed this to man. Now, man has one of two things he can do. He can either accept it, right, and conform himself to what God has revealed, or he can conform what God has revealed to his own desires. What does that mean? So, number one, man can either say, okay, homosexuality is wrong, right? And if he struggles with it, he remains chaste, or if he doesn't struggle with it, right, he just knows that it's wrong and he doesn't engage in it, etc., etc. Or vice versa, and this is the bad part, man can twist what God has said to his own desires. And often, and he can start to make exceptions. He could be like, well, is not the sin of sodomy not really a sin if it's in a loving context, or if we're quote unquote married, or if we save ourselves for our quote unquote wedding day. All of those things are wrong regardless. Homosexuality by in and of itself is a sin, period, right? But the problem that you find oftentimes now of how theology is done is it's become so pastoral that now theology has completely inverted to where it's now, okay, we don't start with the person of God and what God has revealed through divine revelation. We take what God has and we just turn it around. We start with man. Man is the center of the world. Man is the center of all creation. You kind of see this mentality kind of thrown around in Gaudium et Spes a little bit, not wholeheartedly, but a little bit. And man is just the crowning center of everything, and therefore theology must now be conformed to me, as opposed to conforming myself to he who is the person of God. So St. Thomas's theology, as you can see here in the Summa Theologica, starts with part 1, God and the outflowing of his creation. So we start here with God, the treatise on the one God, and then we move on to the treatise or the tract on the triune God. So we understand now more about God. So the God is first and foremost one in essence, but then we move on and we understand what that means, more broadly speaking, 3 in persons, right? 1 in essence, 3 in persons, to the treatise on the triune God. Again, I'm trying to kind of simplify this just so that we don't get bogged down in rabbit holes. And then as you can see here, the outflowing is from his creation. So all things flow out from God. So we see the treatise on creation. So you see how creation, right, and all of its causes, etc., flow out from God. And then the order in which it's created. So the angels being created first before, and then you see the treatise on the 6 days, right? So God creates the angels first, and then he creates the 6 days, the 6 days of creation, right? Then you see the treatise on man, us, right? And you understand what is God creating in man. So you understand, just like you did with the angels, the intellect, the will, and then with man, the passions, etc. And then you see the divine government, how God controls all things, how he governs over all things. That's the first part of St. Thomas's Summa. The second part right here is man, the rational creature, and his return to God. So man, right, unfortunately, because of our sin, we fell, right? We fell, we messed up, we goofed big time, and we now need to return to God. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, the second part, is broken up into 2 individual parts. The first part here is called the Prima Secundae, which just means the first part of the second part. And as you can see here, the treatise on beatitude. So what is man's last thing that we're created for? Because it's very important for us to understand both our beginning and our end. We can see the treatise on human action. So the actions and the choices that we make. And again, this is a big simplification, but man's choices and his actions, whether good or evil, that he can make. The treatise on the passions, so the passions that are inside of us, these parts of our soul. We typically call this more emotions in our own day, but specifically the passions in scholastic language, and we understanding that necessary part of our soul. On habits and virtues, these 2 treatises, right? Understanding what is habits, what are good habits, what are corrupted habits, and then virtues, these rightly practiced, well-ordered actions that help us attain heaven, or if we just naturally practice them, help us just be good human beings. The treatise on vice and sin, seeing how man specifically fell, understanding its causes, understanding its effects, understanding its punishment, right? This is something that we all have to deal with, but we can see this as the effect. Treatise on law, how God corrects and curbs our vice with law, whether that be civil law, but more properly speaking, the natural law implanted into us, the eternal law, and then understanding the specific laws of the old covenant, like things along the nature of the ceremonial law. And then finally, God heals our brokenness and our woundedness with the treatise. And finally, God heals our brokenness and our woundedness with the treatise on grace. God heals our nature through divine grace. The second part of St. Thomas Aquinas' second part of the Summa Theologica is called the Secunda Secundae, which just means the second part of the second part. And he begins here, right, where he left off. So grace is what heals us, but through the power of sanctifying grace, virtues are infused into you through baptism, or initially begin there. And so we, for instance, receive first and foremost these very important three theological virtues: the virtue of faith, the virtue of hope, and the virtue of charity, right? And so he has a treatise on each one of these things: faith, hope, and charity. This is something that, again, you can find in these complex dogmatic manuals, or you can find this as simple as when you have your Latin Mass Missal and you find morning and evening prayers, and you see acts of faith, hope, and charity, making sure that we practice these virtues that are inside of us, these supernatural theological virtues. Then you see here his treatise on the four cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, right? And so he begins with prudence, because prudence is that great intellectual virtue, that virtue that's infused, if you will, into the intellect. His treatise on justice being his longest treatise in the Summa Theologica, about our will. How does our will act justly in accordance with what God has revealed, and also how we treat our neighbor. His treatise on fortitude, right? And so that part of our soul that's called the irascible appetite, practicing this action of fortitude. A modern word for this would be kind of courage, and it is that, broadly speaking. I like the word fortitude much better, but practicing that out. And the virtue of temperance, right? For our part of our soul is called the concupiscible appetite, that appetite inside of us that is prone toward matters of eat, drinking, and reproduction. How are we to practice the virtue of temperance and all the different virtues that are involved with that? He talks then about the charismatic gifts, right? Specifically things along the nature of prophecy and the grace of tongues. He talks about lives in the state of perfection, which are things along the nature of religious life. And then, as you can see here, he finishes his Summa Theologiae with Christ, who is our way, who as man is our way to God, our way back to God, right? So God creates all things, including man. Man falls, and so we must now practice God's commandments, be healed by God's grace, practice the virtues, but ultimately in the person and through the person of Jesus Christ. So his third part right here is called the tertia pars, which again just means the third part. And he begins with Christ, because Christ is our Savior. Christ is our Redeemer. We understand a lot more things about the person of Christ. So we understand his incarnation, right? We understand him assuming manhood in a certain sense, assuming our human nature. We understand things about the person of Christ, how his soul, for instance, down here in question number 10, of the beatific knowledge of Christ's soul. That's a very, very interesting treatise to read. We talk about Christ's being, about Christ's will. We talk about his subjection to his Father, Christ's prayer, the priesthood of Christ, right? The predestination of Christ. We talk about his Blessed Virgin Mary. We talk about the Blessed Virgin Mary. She who is all pure, who is the mediatrix of all graces, who is our co-redemptrix, she who is most pure, most precious. We understand, who is this woman? Who is this magnificent woman? This woman that we as Catholics venerate in such high regard, but yet don't venerate enough. We talk about Christ's birth. We talk about Christ's death. We talk about Christ's resurrection, his life, right? And how he will one day come again to judge the living and the dead as our judge, king, prophet, and priest. And the way in particular in which Christ uses as an instrument, if you will, of our salvation is the sacraments, right? And so the sacraments being our way back to God, we understand what are the sacraments, and we understand the things along the nature of the seven sacraments, which, I mean, right, there's only seven sacraments, and we start with baptism, and then we go into confirmation, into Eucharist, and then into penance. Here is a section which is called the supplement of the Summa Theologiae. Real quick, for those of you who do not know, St. Thomas Aquinas, he passed away before he could finish writing the end of the Summa Theologiae, mainly due to the fact that as he was writing through the Summa Theologiae, he had a great mystical experience that made him put down his pen and quit writing theology. However, after his death, one of his great underlings, if you will, great disciples, Brother Reginald, went ahead and took all of the notes from St. Thomas Aquinas' commentaries on the sentences of Peter Lombard, and continued and finished the Summa Theologiae. And so St. Thomas ends his writing in the Tertia Pars on the subject of penance, but he doesn't finish that treatise on penance. So we understand a bit more about the nature of penance when we pick it up in the Summa. We understand, for instance, contrition, confession, satisfaction, right? Those very necessary elements which make up the sacrament of penance. we understand the legality of what how the sacrament of penance is a legal action that is being taken place by the church, and we understand things along the nature also of excommunications, indulgences, etc. We also get into the sacrament of extreme unction, right? This sacrament, which is, in my personal opinion, so undervalued in our own day and age. And when we understand the traditional understandings of the sacrament of extreme unction, right? This is going to hopefully be the last thing that we do on this earth. We talk also about the sacrament of holy orders, right? About the priesthood, about the bishopric. We understand what does this mean to be an alter Christus. We also go into one of my favorite sections, which is his treatment on the sacrament of marriage. Me, myself, as of right now, I'm very much so open to whatever the Lord has for me in the subject and a question of vocations. However, I do, in prayer and in through discernment, have a very strong inclination to holy matrimony. So reading through a lot of this is something that I very much so enjoy, understanding what is the traditional understanding of marriage. And really, starting here with question 69, he really starts to dive into now, right, if the sacraments are something that we need to practice throughout all of our life, right? If these are our kind of means, our instruments back to God through the person of Jesus Christ, then our last end, what are the four last things that you'll find? So he really covers now in detail the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell, right? So he talks about the judgment of God, and or he talks about human death, right? How we will all one day, as a consequence of our sin, pass away, and how we will be judged, right, by both the particular and the general judgments. He talks about the specifics of what heaven is like and of the bodies of the blessed, and he also covers in great detail the sufferings of the damned and what hell itself is like. Finally, after the supplement, there are these four little articles separated into two appendices, which talk also about specifically what the life of the souls will be like in purgatory, right? So again, every soul that goes to purgatory will go to heaven. However, it's very important for us to understand that real reality, especially when we're finishing the treatise on the four last things. So again, to wrap up here, we can see all things begin with the person of God and his creation, the outflowing of his creation, including us, right? We are man, we're a rational creature, and we fell, unfortunately, because of our sin. So we now need to make our return back to God through keeping his commandments, but specifically by being healed by divine grace. And our grace is given to us, and and our salvation is in the person of Jesus Christ through the instrumentation of the sacraments, infusing God's grace into us so that one day when we die, right, we can inherit by God's grace the kingdom of God itself, heaven itself. You see now how the structure of the Summa is laid out. It's very much so. It goes out from God and it returns from God. That's what exitus rexitus means, essentially, in this context. To exit from, to go from God, and to return to God. Rexitus, to return to God. This is a very Platonic, but it's understanding of the science of theology, but I think it's great. And this is how St. Thomas Aquinas applies it. What this all has to do with specifically what we were going over is that so many of the new thinkers in the world of theology were essentially saying, why? Like, why do we need to do this? Why should we do theology this way? Another thing that's important to note is that when he gave the example of giving out objections first, I'll show you now the structure of how St. Thomas's Summa Theologica works out in order so that you can understand it better. So this is question one of the prima pars, the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. We'll be here in a couple of weeks when we actually go over these questions itself, right? You guys have to understand the treatise on the one God itself is around 700 to 800 pages, right? It's a big book. And so we'll be in this first 27-ish questions for a while. But it's important for us to understand this because this is, again, our faith, and we want to understand our faith well and correctly. How St. Thomas asks and addresses a question is particularly what what some of the Nouvelle Theologie thinkers hated about about how scholastic philosophy and theology works. So essentially what Aquinas does is he asks a question or an article. Well, first and foremost, he treats a subject, right? So for instance, the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. So we're trying to understand what is the essentially purpose, the nature, right? How far does it go, etc., of sacred doctrine. And he talks here and he lists out a bunch of questions in regards to this treatise that he's going to be writing. And he says first in this first one, as an example, whether besides philosophy any further doctrine is required. So right now he's talking about essentially, is divine revelation necessary, or cannot we just through philosophy understand all there is to know about the person of God? And so how St. Thomas does he writes his Summa, is that he will give out objections first, typically two or three, typically three objections to his own position, right? And what he does is he steelmans, or to explain that, he makes his opponent's argument as best as he can. This is something that's very important for us in our own day that we need to do, is that when we're examining the modern errors, when we're examining the problems in secular society or in secular culture, right? The craziness that is Hollywood, media, or politics that come into our arena of vision, that we examine these things, we understand them well, and we give the best case scenario for our opponent. But then, as you can see, what St. Thomas does is he gives first and foremost a short objection or sed contra on the contrary, and usually this is his short rebuttal from the place of authority, right? He gives an argument from authority first as a short rebuttal. Now, again, an argument from authority, one thing you'll find as we go through this tract, and even just as St. Thomas himself will talk about, the argument from authority generally is the weakest form of argument, unless it is based off of a higher principle, being the principle of God and the blessed. But so what he'll do is he'll usually give a very short response, and then he'll give his corpus, or his I answer that, corpus being kind of like the body of his argument. As you can see here, right, it's much longer than the rest of these three things, right? So he gives his good answer. And then what he does is he responds to those particular objections that he laid out before giving his argument. That's how the Summa works, right? And so we go through all of the science of theology from that perspective. It's important for you guys to realize, though, is that as we can see here, as you can see, I'm flipping through lots of tabs, so you just have to forgive me for that. But as you can see through here, this type of going through theology this way is not what these thinkers enjoyed at all, right? As you can see here in this paragraph that we finished with, this is they just essentially saw this as just a conventional way the schools of the 13th century operated. To continue Lagrange's critique of this in defense of Aquinas' method, he says, therefore, now some nowadays in philosophy and also in speculative theology, therefore, some nowadays in philosophy and also in speculative theology, so talking about really the Nouvelle Theologie thinkers, depart from this method, which they say is too scholastic, right? And so you see this especially with the ressourcement thinkers, right? You see this as something that they're trying to get away from, this scholastic idea. But he now brings up something that is very good, and this is one reason that we have this show structured the way that we do. What does the magisterium, right, have to say about this? It says this: already in the time of Pius IX, so Blessed Pius IX, it is evident from the 13th proposition of the syllabus, right, so the syllabus of errors, several said, quote, the method and principles by which the old scholastic doctors cultivated theology are not at all suitable to the demands of our times and to the progress of the sciences. Right. And so this is something that we have to understand. And for those of you who want, this is the old Denzinger system, 1713, that he is citing. Denzinger, for those of you guys who do not know, is essentially a manual, a dogmatic manual that kind of compiles together all the great dogmatic points of our faith. This is an older copy of Denzinger, Denzinger 1713. We're going to go ahead and read this section, even though you can just see it quoted here in this larger page in the One God commentary. We're going to go ahead and read it, but then we're also going to read another section of Denzinger to kind of illustrate the problem against going against the scholastic method. So here it is, Denzinger 1713. Says the method and the principles according to which the ancient scholastic doctors treated theology are by no means suited to the necessities of our times and to the progress of the sciences. Now, again, this statement is a condemned statement. So this highlighted section is something you should not believe in as a Catholic. This is a condemned statement by Pope Pius IX. And so one thing I want to notice here before we go on here, as you're going to see Denzinger 1680, is it says the method and principles, so the scholastic method, the principles underlying this method, etc., of the ancient scholastic doctors, so Aquinas himself absolutely being included in this, treated theology, so the way they did theology, are by no means suited to the necessities of our times or to the progress of science. This was so much of the attitude of novelty that you see pre-Vatican II, specifically in the ressourcement camp. I'm just going to kind of try to call them ressourcement thinkers from going forward because it's a little bit easier to say. But you see in ressourcement thought, They did not think that the scholastic method really at all it was a hit. They didn't see it helping, right, the progress of science. They saw it as hindering the progress of science, and they did not feel it expressed man's modern needs or it was helpful to man's modern needs. But this is again is a condemned statement. We have to recognize it. Now here we are at 1680. Right, and as you can see in 1680, it actually also again cites Denzinger, right? So this was, as you can see here, the Convention of Theologians in Germany from the letter Tuus Libantur to the Archbishop of Munich, right? And this was on December 21st, 1630. Now, this whole essentially sections, whole letter is very much so talking about man's needed ability to understand theology, right? But as you can see through here, as it says right here, just we'll go ahead and we'll just read through these two paragraphs. This whole document is worth reading, by the way. He says, "Indeed, we are aware, venerable brother, that some Catholics who devote their time to cultivating the higher studies, trusting too much in the powers of human ability, have not been frightened by the dangers of errors, lest in asserting the false and incessant liberty of science, they be snatched away beyond the limits, beyond which the obedience due to the teaching power of the Church, divinely appointed to preserve the apostolic, preserve the integrity of all revealed truth, does not permit them to proceed. Therefore, it happens that Catholics of this sort are unhappily deceived, and often agree with those who decry and protest against the decrees of the Apostolic See and our congregation, and they decrees find the free progress of science, right? And they expose themselves to the danger of breaking those sacred ties of obedience by which, according to the will of God, they are bound into this same Apostolic See and by the appointed by God as the teacher and defender of truth." And just to show you, they quoted 1712. So this is again a condemned statement in the Syllabus of Errors, but he says, "The decrees of the Apostolic See and the Roman congregations hinder the free progress of science," right? This is a condemned statement. To continue, it says this, "Nor are we ignorant in that in Germany," always Germany, right? There prevailed false opinions against the old school, so against the scholastic schools, and against the teaching of those supreme doctors, whom the universal church venerates because of their admirable wisdom and sanctity of life. If you want to know more about this idea of the Holy Church venerating, right, specifically these great doctors, go back to one of our first episodes, Sancta Sapientia, Why the Church Needs St. Thomas Aquinas. Again, link will be in the description below. By this false opinion of authority of the church itself is called into danger, because since the church, not only through many contentious centuries, has determined that theological science to be cultivated according to the method and the principles of the same doctors, sanctioned by the common consent of all Catholic schools, but it, the church, also very often extolled their theological doctrines with the highest praise and strongly recommended it as a very strong buttress of faith and formidable armory against its enemies." I could say quite a bit about that, but again, you see, this is so cool, so interesting anyway. That there is this tendency to think that the scholastic method is something that's hindering to science, too arid, too abstract, not good enough or necessary for man's modern needs. When in fact, you find that this mentality is condemned in multiple propositions of the Syllabus of Errors, as well as these different bishops' congregations talking about this error. Unfortunately, this is something that is rampant today. This is something I bring up because, again, at the end of the day, we have a situation now in the church where when we go back to these manuals, when we go back to these old dogmatic references, we find them in many places contradicting the practices of the modern hierarchy. I'm not saying necessarily the propositions always, but the practices of the modern hierarchy. To continue here in this specific paragraph, he says, "Some not considered the profound difference between St. Thomas's method of procedure and a merely a priori or synthetic method adopted by Spinoza seem to admit that St. Thomas's method and even St. Bonaventure's, from the abuse of philosophical deduction, lead to rationalism and pantheism, as clearly seen from the propositions to which the Sacred Congregation of the Index ordered Augustine Bonte to give his assent, 1855, in writing." So you see this critique often sometimes labeled against Thomism and St. Thomas Aquinas, that Aquinas basically takes theology and it just leads to rationalism and pantheism at the end of the day. You hear typically nowadays the rationalist argument given way more than the pantheist argument. However, this is something that you do see. It's just like Aquinas, he sounds like a robot. His method is just the method of a computer programmer, right? It's just leading theology into just pure rationalism. There's no depth. There's no mysticism in it anymore. And this is something that you hear the orthodox say all the time. Again, as you guys can see here, this is footnote 17. And he references Denzinger, 1652. So here we are, right? So this is this is a decree of the Sacred Congregation of the Index, which came out in June of 1855, as Lagrange said. And we're looking at specifically number 1652. It says the method, right, which St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure and the other scholastics after them used does not lead to rationalism, nor has it been the reason why philosophy is in today's schools is falling into naturalism and pantheism. Therefore, it is not lawful to charge as a reproach against these doctors and teachers that they made use of this method, especially since the church approves or at least keeps silent. Right. So this is a problem that you can see, but you see this often charge given by the Nouvelle Theologie thinkers to St. Thomas Aquinas and his method, but particularly the Thomist school that came after that. To continue, he says, now some depart from St. Thomas's method, preferring the historical not only for the useful and necessary investigation in the history of philosophy and theology, but also a more or less direct knowledge or even a philosophical or theological truth. This method of procedure was indeed already in vogue among the followers of idealistic evolutionism, especially with Hegel. So, warning alert, right? And later on, we come across it, though in the modern modified form, in many works of modern authors. Whatever these modifications may be, this method, so it seems, tends by its very nature to confuse philosophy with the history of philosophy, and thus is established by a certain philosophy of the history of doctrines, one that is more or less according to the tenets of evolutionism. Right. So to boil that down really quickly, when he says this term evolutionism, what he's talking about is essentially kind of Darwin's mentality of a change of kinds, of changing from one substance into another, but applying this specifically in the world of philosophy and theology, essentially that philosophy and theology change from one thing into just something completely different. And specifically in the area of dogma, that's just called modernism, right? That dogmatic meanings can change from one thing into something completely different. He says, according to this view, right, to the view of evolutionism, which is not infrequent today among all the systems appearing in the course of time in accordance with the evolution of ideas, no system is absolutely true, but each is relatively true, that is, in opposition to one another preceding doctrine, or else to some other brief evolutionary period of the past, right? So this is what he's talking about, evolutionism. This is something that's false. He says, they say, for instance, Thomism was relatively true in the 13th century in opposition to the doctrines of certain Augustinians, which it surpassed, but it, too, is not absolutely but relatively false with respect to the subsequent systems which, either as an antithesis or as a superior synthesis, is of a higher order in the evolution of ideas. Thus, Scoticism, coming at a later date, would be truer than Thomas's doctrine, and this by the momentum of progress in the history of philosophy and theology. Then why should not this be so far for the nominalism of William Ockham? In like manner, the eclecticism of Suarez, which often seeks to steer a middle course between the system of St. Thomas and that of Scotus, would be still a more perfect synthesis and the beginning of a new process and progress among modern intellectuals. Really, to give you kind of a modern analogy to what he's talking about, because what he's basically saying is that evolutionism, which is essentially saying we're progressing from better to better to better, but instead of building on each other in a natural organic development, rather it's changing from kinds, from one thing to another, to another, to another. The substance changes. It's not a homogeneous development, but it is, kind of just, it's an evolution, right? It changes from one kind to another. To give you a modern example of this, just look at the woke movement of our own day and age. You see how the progressives, their whole mentality when it comes to philosophical understanding of being, right? So you, for instance, say with the subject of what is a woman, you look at that reality and it's just like we've progressed in their minds from understanding woman as an adult human female, at least capable in a biological matter of having children, to now whatever you want it to be. And there's no yardstick which you can refer back to say this is objectively a woman, but it is what you feel like it is. And this is something that you can see to a much lesser extent, but you can see this mentality of kind of changing from one thing and progressing to a better thing and to a much better thing applied to in certain philosophical and theological strands. You see that they're basically saying Aquinas's philosophical and scholastic method was good in the 13th century. The scholastic method had its place, but now we need something for man's modern times that's even better than that. To continue, he's now going to continue this idea of dogmatic evolutionism, or just like tossing the scholastic method in favor of a more modern philosophical system. He's going to continue this, and you're going to see where this ends up. And for those more learned of you, you kind of can see this a mile away. But for the less inclined to study these things, you'll kind of get now a broader understanding of why a certain word, a certain system is really thrown out there as the problem of our day and age, which I'll hold off as you'll see further on down here. He says, if it were so, nothing would be absolutely true, not even the principle of contradiction, at least as a law of being and of higher reason, as Hegel admits. All the more so, none of the accepted definitions would be absolutely true, and hence from none of them could their true properties of things be deduced. There would be only relative truth, and its reference to the present state of knowledge, and this rather as regards the already superseded past than the unknown future. Even for knowing the relative truth of any doctrine, it would be necessary to have full knowledge of the preceding periods of evolution, which were the prerequisites of the manifestation of this ultimate development. By way of illustration, we may say that for a knowledge of what ought to be our philosophical conception according to the intellectual agencies of the 20th century, we could go no further through. We would have to go through Kantianism and Hegelianism, and then vitally reconsider Thomism as to render it truly presentable to modern minds. This is very, very powerful, because what he's talking about is essentially this. If we can't have any certainty, right, essentially, and you see that with his example of the principle of non-contradiction. If we can't have any certainty, then is truth now mutable? Is it now something that can change or evolve? Do we have to keep progressing on to a newer and newer truth, even if it contradicts what came before it? And he uses this by way of illustration. He says we have to go through Kantianism and Hegelianism to vitally reconsider Thomism so as to render it truly presentable to modern minds. Do we now have to take Aquinas and essentially feed him through Hegelianism and Kantianism in order to now present it to the modern world as something that is palatable or understandable to them? And this is what he picks up. He says, yet this new cognition, as regards the mental attitude of the 20th century, would not be absolutely, but only relatively true, just as the cognition of St. Thomas was only relatively true in the 13th century. This conception, and this is what I was telling you guys, a word that you'll see very common today. This conception of truth, however, does not seem to differ from that of the modernists who say, quote, truth is no more immutable than man himself is, in that it is developed within and by him. And you can see this footnote number 18, Denzinger 2058. Now, real quick, as you can see here, this document that Denzinger is referencing, right, the errors of the modernists on the church, revelation, Christ, and the sacraments, from the decree of the Holy Office, right? And so this is the famous document pushed forward by Pope St. Pius X, July 3rd, 1907. And so as you guys can see here, this statement, right, all these statements are condemned proposition. These are the condemned proposition of the modernists. So you can kind of think of this as like Pope St. Pius X's own version of the syllabus of errors, but specifically dealing with the error of modernism. He says, truth is no more mutable than man himself, inasmuch as it is evolved with him, and with him, in him, and through him. Which is interesting language, again, taking from sacred scripture. Most of you probably know that latter phrase, with him, in him, and through him, etc., from the Mass. However, what this is essentially saying, because again, this is a condemned statement, this is heresy, this is false, to kind of zoom in and to kind of give you a better idea, truth is no more immutable, so unchanging, than man himself. So man, we can change, right? We can get older, we can get heavier, we can get, we can fall apart, we can lose limbs, unfortunately, et cetera, et cetera. So man, in a certain sense, is very mutable. And it says this, inasmuch as it evolved with him. So this is through their understanding of evolutionism. So just as in their worldview anyway, man evolved, right, from a primate into a man. Truth can evolve as well from one thing into another. And it evolves in tandem with him. So truth changes and evolves from one thing to another in tandem with man, who changes from one thing to another. But it also goes in him and through him. This goes to show you, again, one of their philosophical errors, thinking that truth has as its point of origin a place inside of man as opposed to something outside of man. We as Catholics believe that truth is something outside of us that we have to receive. Remember, when we're talking about the structure of St. Thomas's Summa, everything starts with God. So God is the beginning and he is our end, right? I am the Alpha and the Omega, first and the last, the beginning of the end, our Lord says in the book of Revelation. That is the truth. And that's the Catholic truth. For man, though, who's a modernist, what he is going to say is that truth is something which comes from inside of me, right? And you see this, right, very much so in the philosophical errors of nominalism, of Kantianism, of liberalism, and here with modernism, right? All of it who has its foundations in a certain naturalistic subjectivism. This idea that truth is somewhere in me. And you hear this so much today in the context of wokeism, this idea of, who's in relativistic ideas, like truth is what you want it to be. It's your truth or it's my truth. If my truth is that you don't exist, then you don't exist. If your truth is that I don't exist, then I don't exist. Or to use even, again, more maybe touching issues, if my truth says that I am a woman, then I'm a woman, regardless of my biology. You know what I'm saying? It's that type of mentality, but applied to theology. And so this idea that theology, what Father Lagrange is getting at, is that theology has to, in a certain sense, according to the modernists and according to these, what he's saying, Nouvelle Theologie thinkers, right? That these Nouvelle Theologie thinkers end up in modernism, is that you start off with questioning the scholastic method, and then you say, well, we need to progress on to something new for man's modern needs. And then you keep going until finally, right? And you take Thomas, you take the scholastic method, you have to run them through Kantianism, through Hegelianism, and then eventually, maybe you can present it to man's modern taste, man's modern appetites. You've cooked him up a recipe that man can palate, if you will. And he says that that's just modernism at the end of the day. And you can see now why so much of the problems with the Second Vatican Council and with the post-conciliar reforms in general is that, while I'm not saying at all that the documents are promulgating definitive heresies, I'm not saying that at all. The language that the council is written in is a non-scholastic language, which renders it ambiguous, which rendered it susceptible to a lot of the modernist heretics who were at the council to fiddle around with the text to make it ambiguous, to where you could get maybe an orthodox interpretation from certain sections, and then also maybe a heretical interpretation for many sections. And that's why there's so much confusion. And you also look at it today in the context of the Holy Father, in the context of a lot of the bishops, is that they give very ambiguous answers, not scholastic answers that are very precise, following the old school method, but very much so something that needs to be served on a shingle for man's modern needs, as they say. That even that phrase, for man's modern needs, has been thrown around so much, but you can see that that's the problem, is that this is what it goes back to. I'll go ahead and read this section again, but I'll go down here and we'll continue going through this. He says, this conception of truth, however, does not seem to differ from that of the modernists. So the ressourcement is essentially ending up in modernism, who said, truth is no more immutable than man himself is. It is that it is developed with him, in, and by him. But this proposition, if we wish to consider the question more seriously, presupposes immanence. So this modernistic idea of divine, or of this modernistic doctrine of immanence, or absolute evolutionism. According to this theory, if Pius IX said in his first proposition of the syllabus, quote, in effect, God is produced in man and in the world, and all things are God and have their very substance of God, and God is one and the same thing as the world, and therefore spirit with matter, necessity with liberty, good with evil, justice and injustice. And you can see here his quotes from 1701. Now that quotation again from Pius IX is a condemned statement, so don't believe that that's what Pius IX was teaching. Pius IX was teaching that that's an error. He says, indeed, the charge is made against St. Thomas that his method, as if it did not differ from Spinoza, leads to pantheism, right? And now the new historical method, which is evolutional in its tone of thought, leads to the form proposed to it, which is pantheism. Spinoza indeed identified all things with the immobile God, while the evolutionists reduce God to universal evolution. According to the evolutionists, God is really in a process of becoming both in man and in the world, and he never will be, in a true sense, as Renan said, Renan being, again, one of these, modernist heretics. Thus, nothing would be absolutely true and nothing absolutely false. There would only be relative truth and relative falsehood. Only relatively would be absolute. The above-mentioned confusion between history and philosophy corresponds to the desire neither of the true historian nor of the true philosopher. But the true historian seeks to acquire knowledge of truth from the facts before the uncertain philosophy established. The desire of the true philosopher is, indeed, to acquire an accurate knowledge of philosophy, but he does not consider the temporal sequence of doctrines as if these were the criterion or sign of the relative truth, and of its sequence of doctrines were always necessarily an evolution of the accident order, but never a resignation of the senile decline. From the fact that Scotus came after St. Thomas, it does not follow that his doctrine is truer, and that later on, the greater perfection is eclecticism of Suarez, right? So he's saying, just because you came after this doesn't mean that you're better. We must use the historical method in the history of doctrines, and this is indeed of great help in understanding the state and difficulty of the question, so as to give us, as it were, a panorama of the solutions of the greater problem. But in philosophy, we must employ the analytic and the synthetic method proportionate to it. In theology, however, we must rely first upon proofs taken from authority of Holy Scripture or divine tradition, or even writings of the Holy Fathers, and in the second place of arguments drawn from reason, while, of course, not neglecting the history of problems and their solutions. All right, so that was a lot, but hopefully this kind of gives you a little bit of the understanding of why we need specifically the method of St. Thomas Aquinas and scholasticism and Thomism in general. So much of the problems, again, for you viewers, that we find inside of the church really come back to this problem of tossing the method, the scholastic method, away and trying to be experimental in our methods of doing theology and philosophy. I hope that made sense, and I hope that kind of cleared things up for you, why it's so important to study through the method of St. Thomas Aquinas, the theology in general, because again, as you guys saw last week, Thomism doesn't just stop with Aquinas, right? It continues onward through the great commentators, through the great scholastic tradition, through the great manualist tradition, up until the time of the council. Unfortunately, nowadays, you just kind of seem to have very little theology being done. And oftentimes when it's done, it's not according to the scholastic method at all. That is one reason why we as traditionalists need to go back to the scholastic method, go back to these old books, read these old books and understand our faith, because if not, we're losing and we're being willfully ignorant oftentimes of our faith. Again, so much of the purpose of this show is to get traditional Catholics, myself included, right, away from what I see as usually our primary argument, matter of our argumentation being conspiracy theories and blogs, changing that and saying, okay, let's go back to these old manuals. Let's read and understand our theology, and then let's critique the modern errors in charity, of course. All right, everyone. Hopefully that made sense. When we continue this next episode, what we'll be doing is going more into the method of St. Thomas Aquinas, particularly his Aristotelian background. And this will hopefully open up to the door for, especially people who are new to Thomas, the necessity of reading Aristotle or at least having some type of Aristotelian understanding before you read St. Thomas Aquinas. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. If this was your first time, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Make sure and give this video a like and subscribe to the show if you have not already done so. Make sure you go ahead and click post notification bell on so that you know when a next episode is being posted. Also, you'll see in the top description below a link to patreon.com/traditional Thomist. You can head over there and type that in yourself if you'd like. But if you would mind donating to this show, is very much so appreciated. I'm again just a young man who's trying to go through his own intellectual journey of understanding my faith better. And I haven't read everything, I haven't read a lot, but I do enjoy reading theologies, particularly this subject of scholasticism, broadly so called. And so if you could help contribute to the making of this show, this would be great, because again, this takes a lot of time and money to make this show. And so know that it is very much so appreciated. Know my prayers for you as my viewers. I definitely all appreciate every single one of you viewers who comes to this show and watches every single time. Make sure and leave a comment or question if you have anything you'd like to say. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. May our Lord bless you, Our Lady keep you, and Saint Joseph watch over and protect you. God bless.